Hello, everyone, and welcome to the UIS Center for Lincoln Studies. My name is Ann Mosley, and I'm the acting director for the center here at the University of Illinois at Springfield. The Center for Lincoln Studies focuses on the study and scholarship of the life and legacy of Abraham Lincoln, our 16th president. And by studying the life of Lincoln, we hope to better understand our past while researching new findings within Lincoln scholarship today to help improve our future. We have great scholars here on campus, but we always look into this new and upcoming scholarship of new authors and historians throughout the nation. And we try to focus on Lincoln in Illinois, but there are important lessons that we can learn about Abraham Lincoln and how he reacted with others around him during his presidency. The programs that we like to offer showcase a diverse range of stories centered around not just Lincoln, but the people who surrounded him, but also influenced his life. And sometimes it's not big name individuals like William Seward or Chase, who were a part of his cabinet. Sometimes it comes from letters from the public. And so tonight we are going to be listening to Dr. Jonathan White discuss his book. And we're going to be focusing on the letters that Lincoln received by African Americans. And his book is titled To Address You as My Friend. I don't know about all of you, but I am personally looking forward to this conversation because it is discussing letters by individuals who were living during a time of unrest, but also uncertainty and hope for the future. And I know a lot of the letters we're going to hear about today are from very strong individuals. So before we get started, I want to make sure to go over some housekeeping. So if you have a question for our presenter, make sure to include that in the comments section. So if you have a question in the midst of the talk, feel free to put it in because we will still get to those at the end of the program. So whether you're on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, as long as you're responding to this particular broadcast, we will get it here. Also, to make things a little interesting tonight, make sure to mention where you're from, what your name is. It's always so neat to see where everyone comes from, whether you're here in Illinois or if you are tuning in from the East Coast, West Coast, or maybe even from a different country. Feel free to put those in the comments as well. So, as we get started, I want to make sure we have as much time as we can for Dr. White. So I'm going to introduce you a little bit about him. He has a very fascinating background. So Dr. White is an associate professor of American Studies at Christopher Newport University. He's the author and editor of 12 books and more than 100 articles, essays, and reviews about the Civil War. His earlier book, Emancipation, the Union Army, and the Re-election of Abraham Lincoln, was named a best book of 2014 by Civil War Monitor. It was the finalist for both the Gilder Lehrman Lincoln Prize and the Jefferson Davis Prize, and won the Abraham Lincoln Institute's 2015 Book Prize. Midnight in America, Darkness, Sleep, and Dreams During the Civil War was named a best book of 2017 by Civil War Monitor. His recent book, Our Little Monitor, The Greatest Invention of the Civil War, was co-authored with Anna Gibson Holloway, was a finalist for the Indie Book Awards, and honorable mention for the John Layman Book Award. He is a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians and serves on the boards of directors of the Abraham Lincoln Institute, the Abraham Lincoln Association, and the Lincoln Forum. He also serves on the board of advisors of the John L. Noe III Center for Civil War History at the University of Virginia. the Ford's Theater Advisory Council, and the editorial board of the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography. In 2019, he won the Outstanding Faculty Award of the State Council of Higher Education for Virginia, the highest award given to faculty in the Commonwealth. Tonight, we will hear about his first of 3 books that he is publishing this year, all centered around letters. So without further ado, Dr. Jonathan White, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Well, I'm looking forward to your book and looking on Twitter where you like to hang out.
Yes.
As Civil War John. And you've been posting quite a few letters from the book as little tastes of what readers will be able to see. And I love that you're getting your family involved in the book as well. So I hope individuals will get a chance to tune in on Twitter and see all the wonderful work you've been doing.
Thank you. And I should say, if anyone is tuning in here and wants to follow me on Twitter, it's Civil War John, just Jon. There's also a Civil War John, JOHN. Don't follow that guy. I don't know who he is, but JON is me. And yeah, and the official publication date is October 26th. And so I started about 2 weeks ago, and I'll just post 21 letters in the lead up to the pub date, giving people a taste of what they can find in the book.
Well, wonderful. Well, John, I'm going to pass the baton on to you and let you get started.
Great. Well, I will share my screen here and show a PowerPoint. Let's see. And I'll tell you all about some of the... Now, is it showing?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. And let me start the slideshow. There we go. So this is the front cover of the book. And it's officially coming out October 26th, but it is available now. Amazon started shipping them a couple of days ago. And the book consists of 125 letters from African Americans to Abraham Lincoln. I started collecting these around 2014, working on just finding as many letters as I could, and then transcribing them and editing them and learning what I could about the correspondence. And since I'm I guess electronically in Springfield with you here, and you're in Springfield, I want to give a shout out to the Papers of Abraham Lincoln Project, which is run out of the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum. I could not have done this project without them. They are digitizing as many letters to and from Lincoln as they can find. And so far they've put about 80 or over 81,000 up online on their website. And many of the letters that I'll talk about here tonight are from that collection. And in fact, you'll see a lot of scans of letters, all but one of them come from the Papers of Abraham Lincoln. And so I'll show you here, these are the faces of some of the men who wrote to Lincoln. I say men because I have not yet been able to find any images of any of the women who wrote to Lincoln. Out of the 125 letters, about 21 of them were written by women, and then the rest were written by men. And these are some of the folks that I'll talk about tonight. I decided for tonight I'm going to focus mostly on people I have images of so that you can kind of have a name and a face together. Some of these men are going to look famous to you. Most of you will recognize the person at the top center, Frederick Douglass. But most of these folks are not very well known today, although some of them were famous in their day. There's one here who I'll talk about who went on to become a member of Congress. And then in the middle of this collage, I have this image of Abraham Lincoln sitting at his desk in the White House. And I love this picture connected with these other images, thinking about, Lincoln sitting in that chair at this desk, reading letters that he received from Americans all over the country, black as well as white. Now, 21 of the letters are from the Library of Congress, and I'll give a shout out to our friend Michelle Crowell for all of the help that she has been to me in my research over the years, and she is the person who is in charge of the Lincoln collection at the Library of Congress. And so 21 of the letters in the book come from that collection, and I'll tell you about a few of the people who wrote to Lincoln who, Lincoln kept these letters in his private collection, and then they wound up in his son's possession and now are at the Library of Congress. And one of them came from a man named Leonard Grimes, who you see pictured here. Leonard Grimes was a Baptist minister. He had been born in Virginia, born free in Virginia, and he had helped enslaved people escape. And for doing that, he was arrested and thrown in prison in Richmond for a while. When he got out of prison, he moved to Boston and he continued to work on the Underground Railroad there. And then when the Civil War comes around and then African-American men are allowed to start enlisting in the Union Army, he works as a recruiter and helps recruit men for the very famous regiment, the 54th Massachusetts. And in August of 1863, Grimes leads a delegation of 11 Black Baptist ministers to meet with Abraham Lincoln at the White House. And they present a letter. And they ask Lincoln for protection to go into Union lines to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ. And Lincoln listens to their requests, and he writes out a note essentially giving them permission, saying that their object was a worthy one, or the object is a worthy one. And from Lincoln's perspective, as long as their missionary work didn't interfere with the work of the army, he was fine with allowing them to do that. Another letter that's in the Lincoln Papers is from members of the African Civilization Society, which was an organization in New York City that saw itself as wanting to take what they called civilization to people of African descent wherever they were around the world. And so 5 members of the African Civilization Society go to the White House and meet with Lincoln on November 5th, 1863. And 2 of those men were George W. Lever and Richard Harvey Kane, who you see pictured here. And they went to the White House to meet with Lincoln and present a petition asking for $5,000 to support their work. And they were hoping that Lincoln could give it out of a colonization fund that Congress had appropriated. And it's not clear whether or not Lincoln gave the money. In his papers at the Library of Congress, there's a draft for $5,000 that was made out to them. It's not signed by Lincoln, so the likelihood is that the money was not given. I wanted to go to the National Archives and see if I could find anything in the Treasury records or Bureau of Accounting records, but unfortunately then COVID hit and I wasn't able to follow up on that. Richard Harvey Kane, who you see pictured on the bottom here, was another man who had been born in Virginia, and he was educated at, I want to say, Wilberforce University. And he wrote to Lincoln again in January of 1864, again asking for support in missions. And one of the interesting things about Kane is that after the Civil War, he settled in South Carolina, where he became involved in Republican Party politics. He was elected to Congress, and he served as the pastor of the Emmanuel Church, AME Church in Charleston. So he's a very prominent figure in the mid-19th century who writes to Lincoln twice and also meets Lincoln. Another man who not only corresponded with Lincoln, but knew Lincoln very intimately was William Slade. William Slade was the valet at the White House. He was the 3rd ranked member of the White House staff. If you've seen the Lincoln movie by Spielberg, Slade is depicted in there. And Slade was with Lincoln every day. And in fact, Slade's daughter, Josephine, later said that her father knew Lincoln so well that he was in intimate conversation with Lincoln about policy. And she said that Slade knew every word of the Emancipation Proclamation before it was even issued. Now, in 1864, a group of African Americans wrote to Secretary of War Edwin Stanton asking for a certain white officer to be appointed to be an officer in a black regiment. And Slade wrote out a little cover letter that he addressed to Lincoln endorsing this. And so he used that sort of personal connection to the president to try to help these other African Americans get their desire before the War Department. And then the last one that I'll mention, there are a lot of wonderful letters at the Library of Congress, but the last one I'll mention is from Williamfleurville, or Billy the Barber, who was a very prominent person in Springfield in the years around the Civil War. Fleurville was a Haitian immigrant. He moved to the United States, first to New Orleans and then up to Baltimore, and then eventually he settled in Illinois. And the story that comes out of an old Sangamon county history book from the 19th century is that Fleurville was, walking through Illinois, passing through on his way to Springfield, and he made a stop in New Salem one night where he met a young, lanky guy named Abraham Lincoln. And Lincoln apparently invited Fleurville back to his home for a meal and a place to stay that night. And then Fleurville went on his way. And Lincoln and Fleurville remained close. Lincoln, of course, moves to Springfield in 1836, so a few years after Fleurville did. And they were close friends. Fleurville cut Lincoln's hair, and Lincoln did legal work and tax work for Fleurville. Fleurville owned a lot of property in Springfield. And in 1863, in December of 1863, Fleurville sends a really touching private letter to Lincoln, where he catches Lincoln up on the news from what's going on in Springfield. He lets him know the family dog Fido is doing okay. He sends his condolences. Willie Lincoln had died the year before, and Fleurville talked about what a great boy Willie had been. He told Lincoln, he gave Lincoln his gratitude for having issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and he told Lincoln that he hoped he would be reelected the following year in 1864. Now, I call the book To Address You as My Friend because one of the things I try to show is that African Americans had a very real personal connection to Lincoln. They felt a personal connection to Lincoln. The great Black historian Benjamin Quarles wrote in the 1950s that in the 19th century, African Americans saw their politics through personalities. And so when they thought about their politics during the Civil War, they thought about Abraham Lincoln. And so the book as a whole shows how many African Americans who never met Lincoln thought about him as a friend. But I open up the book with Billy the Barber's letter because Williamfleurville actually was a friend of Lincoln's, and I thought it would be a nice way to open up this collection. Some of the other letters that survive in the Lincoln papers at the Library of Congress are from former slaves who write to Lincoln to either thank him for the Emancipation Proclamation or to show him how they're learning how to read and write. And Anne mentioned how I'm tweeting something every day. I just tweeted about 30 minutes ago, right before coming on, the letter for today. And it was a letter from a soldier named Hannibal Cox, who wrote to Lincoln. He copied out a poem from Harper's Weekly. And then at the very bottom, he said, I'm doing this so you can see how I'm learning how to read and write. And then at the bottom, he said, this is for your eyes. I hope you won't laugh at me. And again, it's as if this man, Hannibal Cox, was having a conversation with Lincoln and saying, you know, I'm learning here. Don't laugh at me as I learn. And of course, Lincoln wouldn't have. Lincoln saved it in his collection of papers. Another source of correspondence that I mined was in newspapers and pamphlets. Some of these were public letters. In one case, Lincoln wrote a letter to two Black men. Alexander Crummell was one of them. Crummell and another man named John D. Johnson met with Lincoln in April 1862 at the White House, and they were emigration commissioners from Liberia. So they go to Lincoln and they try to get him to support colonization, sending African Americans to Africa. And word got out that they had favored deportation of African Americans. And so it was in the press, it was in the Black press that these guys supported deportation. And so they write to Lincoln and ask him, can you make the record straight? And so Lincoln sends them a letter saying, we didn't talk about deportation and you have permission to publish this in the press. And so Crummell and Johnson do. And that's how we know of that letter. It does, as far as I know, the original does not survive. Now, George Vashon, who you see at the bottom of the screen here, was a Black academic in the 19th century. He was a college professor, very learned. He opposed colonization, and he wrote one of several public letters that I have in the book of African Americans who opposed colonization, and they criticized Lincoln for taking the position that he did early in the war, advocating for African Americans to leave the country and go to Liberia or go to Central America. And then another one that I have in the book is from Abraham Galloway. Galloway is one of these incredible figures in the 19th century. He was born into slavery in North Carolina in the 1830s. He escapes on a turpentine ship. He and another friend, they go below decks. They escape to Philadelphia, where William Still finds them, the great Black abolitionist from Philadelphia. And William Still described what it was like when he found them, brought them up out of the ship, and the turpentine had opened up the pores on their bodies and they were bleeding profusely, but now they were at least free. And Galloway stayed in the North during the rest of the antebellum period. And then the Civil War comes around and he goes back to the South. He works as a spy for Benjamin Butler. And then he becomes a recruiter of Black soldiers in North Carolina. And in April of 1864, he and 5 Black men, some of whom had been born free, some of whom were born enslaved, they go to the White House. They walk through the front door. They go into Lincoln's office. They shake the president's hand, and they give him a petition calling for the right to vote. And in this petition, they say Black men voted in North Carolina from 1776 to 1835, and it went off without incident. And there's no reason that we now shouldn't have this right to vote. And Lincoln had a conversation with them, expressed his feelings that they should have the right to vote, but it wasn't something he could support publicly at that time. And we only know about this meeting and this petition because a report of the meeting and then the petition itself appeared in the pages of the New York Anglo-African, a Black newspaper out of New York City. And so those are some of the letters that I was able to find and pull together through newspaper sources. And one of the things that's just wonderful about doing research today is that so many newspapers are digitized that I was able to find some things that hadn't really been used before through digital searches. The vast majority of the letters that I have in the book come from the National Archives. And so the rest of the ones I'll talk about are from the National Archives. This is Alexander T. Augusta. He is one of the most remarkable figures of the Civil War era. He had been born into a free Black family in the 1820s in Norfolk, Virginia, about 30 minutes away from where I am sitting right now. Sometime in the 1830s, his family moved to Baltimore. My theory is they are a free Black family, and Virginia clamps down on African Americans in the aftermath of Nat Turner's rebellion, and so which was in 1831. And so at some point after that, they moved to Baltimore. Augusta decides he wants to be a doctor. He applies to Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia, and he is denied admission on account of his race. And so he goes to Toronto, where he attends medical school and becomes a doctor. And he winds up working as a physician in Toronto and training some other Black doctors during that time for about 6 years in the late 1850s and early 1860s. Well, the Civil War comes around, and then on January 1st, 1863, Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation. And 6 days later, Augusta writes to Abraham Lincoln this letter, January 7th, 1863. And he says, having seen that it is intended to garrison the U.S. forts, etc., with colored troops, I beg leave to apply to you for an appointment as a surgeon of some colored regiment. And he goes on to describe how he left the country because of racial prejudice to get his medical education. And then at the top of the right-hand side, he says, I am now prepared to practice medicine, and would like to be in a position where I can be of some use to my race. And so he says this to Lincoln, I want to be a doctor in the Army. I want to help these Black men who are going to be joining the Army be able to fight for freedom. And so Lincoln allows for him to come to Washington, D.C. and to be examined. But the problem is the medical elites in the Army establishment do not want a Black doctor. And so the Surgeon General of the Army and other leading physicians try to have his invitation rescinded. Secretary of War Stanton steps in and requires that he be given the examination. His examination, according to witness, was a squeezing that many white doctors would not have been able to survive, but he passed with flying colors. And afterwards, the Surgeon General of the United States Army went to the examining doctor, and I'm going to censor it a little bit here, but the doctor's name was Cronin. He said, I say, Cronin, how is it that you came to let the N-word pass? And the doctor replied, the truth is, sir, the N-word knew more than I did, and I couldn't help myself. And so Alexander Augusta is commissioned a major in the U.S. Army, and he is in Washington, D.C., in charge of the contraband hospital for a time, which is now Howard University Hospital. But he faces incredible violence and racial discrimination during this time in the Army. White doctors refuse to serve with him or under him. When he passes through Baltimore at one point in 1863, he is brutally beaten by white ruffians who punch him in the face, giving him a bloody nose, and rip off his shoulder straps. when he's riding on a streetcar in Washington, D.C., he tries to get on the streetcar, and they say, you're not allowed to ride in it. You have to sit up front with the driver. And he refuses. And they say, fine, you can't come on. You have to walk. And so he sees all of this discrimination and violence directed towards him, but he is not going to be kept down by it. And one night, February 23rd, 1864, he and another black doctor, Anderson Abbott, who you see pictured here, decide that they are going to go to the White House. And so for a Tuesday evening reception, they go to the White House, they walk in, they give their coats to the servant at the front door, and they go in and shake Abraham Lincoln's hand. And Mary Lincoln sends Robert over to the president, and Robert says something along the lines of, are you going to allow this innovation? And the president says, why not? And then he shakes Anderson Abbott's hand. Robert slinks back over to Mary, and these two men then walk through the East Room of the White House as onlookers are staring at them with a mixture of wonder and amazement and anger and bewilderment. Every emotion that a white person would have at seeing an African American walk through the White House was experienced that night. And we know about that experience because Anderson Abbott later wrote a long description of it and what it was like for him to be in that moment. Now, another person to meet with Lincoln was a man named Paschal Randolph. And Paschal Randolph was a famous black spiritualist and also a sex magician. And I have to confess, I don't know quite what a sex magician was. So during the Q&A, please don't ask me because I don't have a solid answer. I have some guesses, but I'm not willing to have those guesses on YouTube. And he's an interesting character who was born to a white parent and a black parent in New York. He was orphaned at a young age, and he's living on the streets in New York City near the Five Points neighborhood. But he rises to become educated. He meets with Lincoln early in the war, and then he sends Lincoln this letter saying that he wants to be a recruiter for black soldiers. And Lincoln says to Paschal Randolph, you would be better off as an educator than as someone affiliated with the army. And so Randolph does that. He becomes an educator. And after the Civil War, he moves to New Orleans, where he helps found a school called the Abraham Lincoln School. In 1863, Randolph published a book called Pre-Adamite Man. And on the bottom right of your screen, you can see the dedication of this book to honest Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, as a testimonial of my gratitude for his efforts to save the nation and widen the area of human freedom. And this is the school, the Abraham Lincoln School, that Randolph helped found in New Orleans. This is an image from 1866. Randolph, incidentally, I'll go back to his picture for a moment while I talk about him. Randolph had been badly treated by white abolitionists. Randolph wrote about meeting the father of Robert Gould Shaw, who was an abolitionist. He was the head of the Freedmen's Relief Association, or one of the Freedmen Relief Associations. Randolph goes in to meet with Robert Gould Shaw's father and is rudely told to get out of the room. And Randolph later wrote about this and said, I was treated this way clearly because of the color of my skin. He did not have that experience when he met with Abraham Lincoln. Another man who wrote to Lincoln was a man named Jeremiah Asher. Jeremiah Asher was the grandson of a man who had been kidnapped in Africa. When his grandfather was 4 years old, he was kidnapped. And it's this tragic story where the grandfather was 4 and the grandfather's older brother was running with him, being chased by slave catchers or slave traders. And the brother ran with the 4-year-old as long as he could. And then eventually he just couldn't do it any longer. And he put this 4-year-old boy down, and he gets captured and sent across the Middle Passage in the mid 18th century or late 18th century. And that 4-year-old boy grew up and had a child who then had another child, Jeremiah Asher. So Asher is born free in Connecticut in 1812. And he rises to become a Christian minister. He's ordained in 1840. And by the time of the Civil War, he is shepherding a church in Philadelphia. And he writes this letter to Abraham Lincoln saying, we need more Black chaplains in the service because Black soldiers want Black chaplains ministering to them. Well, a number of people write to Lincoln and say, hey, Jeremiah Asher, he would be a really good chaplain. And so Lincoln makes him a chaplain in the 6th U.S. Colored Troops. And Asher comes down to the Tidewater part of Virginia, again, where I am tonight, and he serves with the 6th U.S. Colored Troops. He goes down into North Carolina, where he recruits more soldiers to fight in that regiment. Sadly, he overexerted, and he ended up dying, and he is the only Black chaplain to die during the Civil War. You'll notice a little bit of a theme here. I'm going to talk about a couple of chaplains. I've told you about two, and here's one more. This is Chauncey Leonard. And one of the reasons there are a handful of chaplains in the book is that they had very good literacy rates. In order to be a chaplain, you had to be literate. And so those are some of the people who were able to write to Abraham Lincoln. And Chauncey Leonard met with Lincoln actually in 1862. And he met with Lincoln and said, I want to help lead African Americans back to Africa, to Liberia. Will you give me some of that money that Congress has given you for colonization? And I'll go on a scouting trip, and we'll see if we can then take other Black Baptists over to Liberia. Lincoln gives him $200 for this trip. And so Chauncey Leonard goes to Liberia. He gets very sick while he's over there, and he comes back to the United States. And after Leonard recuperates from this trip, he sends this letter to Lincoln. And he says, being anxious to accomplish the greatest amount of good to the colored soldiers of the United States Army, I most respectfully ask to be appointed hospital chaplain at the Hospital for Colored Troops in this place. And Leonard gets the appointment. He becomes the chaplain in Alexandria, Virginia, for the USCT hospital. And he serves there. He ministers to the Black soldiers. He tells them about his trip to Africa. He preaches the gospel. He writes letters for them, for those who are illiterate, and he sends condolence letters. And this is a photo of him. He's at the far right, and he's with some of the men at his hospital. And one of the really interesting things about this photograph is all of these other soldiers are identified. And when you look at 19th century African-American photographs, so often we have no idea who they are, but in this case, they're all identified. And when Lincoln died in April of 1865, Leonard wrote about it. And this is just a very short excerpt that gives you a sense, again, of the deep personal connection that African Americans felt for Lincoln at the end of the Civil War. Leonard said this: as soldiers in the U.S. service, we mourn the loss of our noble chief magistrate. We have looked to him as our earthly pilot to guide us through this national storm and plant us securely on the platform of liberty and equal political right. But God in his wise providence has removed him. Brave men weep for him who is no more. Another chaplain, I'll tell you about one more after him, but this is the last one for a little while. Another chaplain to write to Lincoln was a man named Benjamin Franklin Randolph. And as far as I know, B.F. Randolph had no relation to the sex magician. This Randolph was born in Kentucky. He wound up becoming a Black chaplain during the Civil War. His letter to Lincoln is not particularly newsworthy. He writes to Lincoln and says that a chaplain's uniform doesn't look like any different from another, an army chaplain doesn't look different from another kind civilian chaplain, and we don't get the respect we should. So can you redesign the chaplain's uniform? So as far as letters go, it's not the most important. But Randolph is a really significant figure in post-Civil War Reconstruction. And he goes to South Carolina during the war, and then he stays in South Carolina after the war. He becomes involved in Republican Party politics. He's chairman of the Republican State Party. He gets elected to the state Senate. He's out there fighting for equal rights. And very sadly, one day in 1868, Randolph is standing in a train depot out on the platform. 3 white supremacists come up to him and assassinate him in broad daylight. And a newspaper account of this said that he was a victim of rebel hate. And this was one of the last letters that I found from an African American to Lincoln, and I was able to slip it in at the very end of the process. And I was really glad to get this person in here so that he can get some attention that he very richly deserves as a martyr for civil rights. Now, many of you probably are familiar with the issue of black pay during the Civil War. African-American soldiers enlisted under the understanding that they would be paid the same amount as white soldiers. So they thought they'd be getting $13 a month. And then they join and they find out, well, you're going to be paid as laborers instead. So they only get $10 a month. And not only that, a laborer would have an additional $3 deducted from their pay. And so while they're expecting $13 a month, they wind up really getting $7 a month. And this is really hard to live on. And so many black soldiers refuse to accept the diminished pay, and some of them mutiny, and then some of them write to Lincoln and say, we deserve our full pay. And so I'm going to tell you about a few soldiers, and then I'll read a couple of excerpts from some letters as well. This is Thomas Pepper. He was a Canadian who crossed the river into Detroit, where he enlisted in the 102nd U.S. Colored Infantry, and he never got the bounty he was promised, or he claimed he didn't, and so he sent a letter to Lincoln calling for that bounty money. This is John Freeman Shorter. Now, Shorter was in the 55th Massachusetts, which is a sister regiment of the 54th. The 54th filled up, and so they had to create another regiment very quickly. And there was a mutiny incident in the 54th Massachusetts where a private named Wallace Baker got very angry one day and cursed at a white officer. He said, "I won't stand to attention for you or any other damned white officer." And an all-out brawl erupted in the 55th, and Wallace Baker gets arrested and court-martialed and sentenced to be executed. And he ends up getting shot to death. And as he's getting ready to be shot, they ask him if he has any last words. And I was thinking about this recently. It's kind of curious that they do that. I don't think that was common at military executions. Do you have any last words? But he says, "Yes, go and tell your damned lieutenant to fire and be damned, and I'll meet him either in heaven or hell and get even with him." Now, this all happens in May of 1864. And a few weeks later, in July of 1864, John Shorter sends a letter to Lincoln laying out their demands. And it's signed by 74 black soldiers from the 55th Massachusetts. And the issue here is these men enlisted as soldiers, they're being court-martialed as soldiers, they're being executed as soldiers, but they're being paid as laborers. And so here's one short excerpt from this petition where Shorter says that to us, money is no object. We came to fight for liberty, justice, and equality. These are gifts we prize more highly than gold. For these we left our homes, our families, friends, and relatives most dear, to take, as it were, our lives in our hands and to do battle for God and liberty. And after giving a series of points that they make, they close with this language. They said that if immediate steps are not taken to relieve us, we will resort to more stringent measures. And I do want to point out of the 74 men who signed this petition, 11 were killed in action and 9 more were wounded. Now, a number of African-American men and women wrote to Lincoln asking for equal pay. And some of these are the most heart-wrenching letters you'll ever read. And I'll read you just a couple of excerpts from a few of them. A woman named Esther Ann Jackson had a husband fighting in the 3rd U.S. Colored Infantry. She wrote to Lincoln in January of 1864, "Now I set down to write a few lines to see what can be done for my husband. He has been out for 6 months and has got no pay yet, and he is sick, and I want to know if he can't come home. I have 3 small children and no way for to get along." Soldiers hated seeing their wives and their children suffering. They hated knowing that they were suffering and starving and maybe getting kicked out of their homes. In the book, I have a letter from 4 non-commissioned officers in a Louisiana regiment. Here's just a very little bit of what they wrote. "Please, Your Honor, when we enlisted in the United States service, the understanding was that we should receive the same pay and ration as the white soldiers. We have the same feeling for our wives and children as at home, and we study the welfare of them as much as the white soldiers. They are in a starving condition, and we can't support them on $7 a month. Please, Your Honor, All we ask is justice bestowed on us, and there shan't be one star in the glorious banner of liberty that won't shine brightly out over all the patriots fighting to maintain your just law. Please, your honor, we don't look for any better treatment than the white soldiers, but the same. The cannon and rifles ball have not a bit of respect of persons in action. Our lives is as sweet to us as it is to them that receives $13 a month. And I think that last line is so powerful because you have these soldiers reminding Lincoln, when the bullets are flying, we are just as likely to be shot as a white soldier. And because of that, we deserve the same pay. The last one I'll tell you about is Samuel Harrison. He was the chaplain of the very famous 54th Massachusetts. He was owed $100 a month as a chaplain plus 2 rations. And when he went to get paid, the paymaster said, well, you can have $10 a month. And Samuel Harrison refused. And he said, I deserve the $100 that a chaplain gets. And he wrote to Lincoln. Lincoln forwarded it to the War Department. And eventually Harrison did get the full $470 that was owed to him. With black men serving in the army, they begin to make a public claim for the right to vote. In January of 1864, a very long petition was written out in New Orleans by the wealthy free black population of that city, and it was signed by 2 men, Arnold Bertineau and Jean-Baptiste Roudineau, and then 28 veterans of the War of 1812, black men who had fought with Andrew Jackson, and then 1,000 signatures follow. And if I had typed out all 1,000 of them, I'd still be working at it, and the book wouldn't be out yet. So I only include the first 2 names in the book. But Bertineau and Roudineau go to the White House, and they present this petition to Lincoln. And the argument they make is, we are wealthy, light-skinned black Americans who pay taxes, who contribute to the war effort. Our ancestors fought in the revolution, or fought in the War of 1812. We deserve the right to vote. And Lincoln sits down with these 2 men, and he says to them essentially, I think you should have the right to vote, but my number one priority is winning the war. And unless you can, I'm paraphrasing, but unless you can show me how giving black people the right to vote will help win the war, I can't justify it as a military measure. And Lincoln sat down with these 2 men and wrote some things out. And one witness to the scene said that there were Southern gentlemen present, and their prejudices received a shock from seeing Lincoln sit down and have this conversation with these men. Well, Bertineau and Roudineau went away, and they wrote out a new petition 7 days later on March 10th. And in this new petition, they made a different claim. Rather than call for the right to vote for the light-skinned, wealthy, elite, free people of color in Louisiana, they called for the right to vote for all black men, whether they had been born into slavery or born free. And the argument that they make is that if black men are given the right to vote, they will be able to outvote ex-Confederates. And the argument was simple. You look at the white population of the South, the overwhelming majority are traitors. You look at the black population of the South, they are all loyal to the Union cause. And if you want to win the war and secure the peace, the way to do it is to give black men the right to vote. And so they make this argument. They say by giving black men the right to vote, it would give, quote, full effect to all Union feeling in the rebel states, in order to secure the permanence of the free institutions and loyal governments now organized therein. And Lincoln, it is unclear, but I think that these 2 men returned to the White House on March 12th and gave Lincoln this petition. So I think they met with him twice, although the record is not definitive on this, so it's speculation. But the very next day, on March 13th, Lincoln wrote out a letter to the governor-elect of Louisiana, Michael Hahn, with a very famous line that many of you will recognize, where Lincoln says that the right to vote should be given to intelligent black men, meaning educated, and also those, he said, who have fought gallantly in our ranks. And Lincoln said this, these voters would probably help in some trying time to come to keep the jewel of liberty within the family of freedom. Now, those eloquent words are Lincoln saying, that the best way to preserve Republican, small r, Republican government is to welcome African Americans into the body politic, to give them a voice in the system. And it's then a couple weeks after this that Lincoln meets with that former slave, Abraham Galloway, that I told you about at the beginning. And again says, these people, you should have the right to vote. Lincoln would work behind the scenes for the next year. And then finally, on April 11th, 1865, he would give a speech on the balcony of the White House where he would call for limited black male suffrage. And of course, as I'm sure most of you know, John Wilkes Booth was in the audience that night, said that means N-word citizenship. That's the last speech he'll ever give. And then 3 days later, Booth shoots and kills Lincoln. Now, about 21 of the letters were written by women, and so I want to talk just about a couple of these. This is a very famous letter. It was discovered by one of my mentors, Ira Berlin and Leslie Rowland, and the editors of the Freedman and Southern Society Project. It was a slave from Maryland, and she writes to Lincoln in August of 1864, saying, "I want to visit my relatives on the Eastern Shore, and my mistress won't let me. Am I free? Am I a free person to be able to go and see my relatives?" Sadly, she was not yet free because Maryland was a loyal state. It was not within the Emancipation Proclamation. And so Maryland slaves were held in bondage until the state of Maryland ratified a new constitution abolishing slavery in October of 1864. And it then went into effect on November 1st, 1864. So Annie Davis would become free soon, but she wasn't free yet. Another letter. Why is this not? There we go. I'm going to skip that one. Oh. Another letter is from a contraband in Washington, D.C. named Julia Rouser. And Julia Rouser was illiterate. She could not write on her own. And so if you look at the very bottom of this, you can see her mark. And she wrote to Lincoln. Her husband had been conscripted into the army or was serving in the army. She had no support for her family. She's a contraband or a black refugee in Washington, D.C., and she needs help. And I wanted to highlight a black refugee in Washington to then show this beautiful image in the background here. Abraham Lincoln, on his way from the White House to the soldiers' home, would occasionally stop at the contraband camp in Washington, which is near where Howard University is today. And there are accounts of the contraband singing to Abraham Lincoln. And this is a photograph. You can see the contrabands. They're holding little hymnals. They're getting ready. They're preparing to sing for the president when he's going to get there later in the day. And it's again speaks to that personal connection. Who knows? Maybe Julia Rouser is one of the people in this photograph who sang for Lincoln. The last letter I'm going to tell you about is from a woman named Elizabeth Shorter. Elizabeth Shorter was a teenager living in Washington, D.C. She was working for a shoemaker named Francis Pruitt or Frank Pruitt. And one night she went to bed on the sofa in Pruitt's store. And Pruitt came in and he sat down next to her and she said, "Who is it?" And he said, It's me, Frank. I want to sleep with you. I want to get into bed with you." And she tries to say no. She says, "I'm tired, go away." And he persists and he insists and he forces himself on her. And this happens on several occasions. And Lizzie Shorter becomes pregnant. And she becomes pregnant at about the same time as Frank Pruitt's wife. And one day she goes to Frank and she says, "You need to support your child. You said you would support your child." And he says no. And then he says, "I want you to get out of the house." And so Lizzie decides that she's going to confront him in front of his wife. And so one day she goes into their bedroom and she confronts him and says, "You said you would support your child." And Frank turns to his wife, who's nursing her own child of his, and says, "Do you believe this damned black bitch?" And she says, "I do, Frank. You've been acting as though you've been scared of Lizzie for months." And Frank at that point grabs a revolver and he points it at Lizzie and he threatens to shoot her. And he says, "I never intended to die a natural death." And his wife grabs the revolver out of his hand and says, "No, you're not going to murder someone over my child." At that, Frank jumps out of bed. He grabs Lizzie around the neck and shoves her against the wall, goes to choke her, and then says, essentially, "Get out of my house and take your things with you." Well, Lizzie goes running from the house. She comes back later that day, gets her belongings, and Frank Pruitt's wife gives her some money and says, "Take this. It's to support you for a little while, but you're not allowed to mention your connection to my husband." Well, Lizzie goes the next day to the local court, and she gets a warrant out on Frank for what he has done. And Frank retaliates and gets a warrant out on her for larceny. He goes to court and he's acquitted. She's in jail for about a week, and at some point around this time in spring or early summer of 1864, her baby dies. She then goes to trial on November 3rd, 1863, and she's found guilty of grand larceny. The money that Frank Pruitt's wife gave her, she's accused of stealing. She's convicted on November 3rd, the day of her trial. The next day, she sends a letter to Abraham Lincoln, and she was illiterate, and so someone else wrote it out for her, and you can see here, she signed it with her mark. And she wrote this letter to Abraham Lincoln describing what happened. She talked about getting impregnated by Pruitt. She explained further down in a part that I don't show here how the money had been given to her. She had not stolen it. And Lincoln looked at this letter, and I can't help but imagine the many feelings that circled through his heart and his mind as he read this letter from this young Black woman who had lost a child. Lincoln, of course, had lost 2 children by this point. Lincoln had lost an infant brother when he was little. Lincoln had lost his mother, his older sister. He knew the pain of loss. Lincoln also had a very strong sense of justice. He did not like how women were treated differently than men when it came to sexual indiscretions. And Lincoln wrote a little poem about this in the 1830s that I actually have memorized because I've quoted it so many times to my students. Lincoln said, "Whatever spiteful fools may say, each jealous ranting yelper, no woman ever played the whore unless she had a man to help her." Now, I visited the Lincoln Memorial recently. I looked on the walls. I didn't see that up there. I think maybe it should be carved in marble, but it hasn't been yet. But what's Lincoln's point? When it comes to sexual indiscretions, there's a double standard, and men and women are treated differently. And so I think and Lincoln himself believed that his mother had been conceived when a wealthy Virginia planter took sexual advantage of a poor white woman in Virginia. And that was a painful memory for Lincoln. And so I think with all of these things in his mind, or at least in as part of who he was as a person, he very quickly acted. And on the very next day, wrote "Pardon A. Lincoln," November 5th, 1864, on the back of Lizzie Shorter's letter. Before she could even be sent to prison, she was released. And what's all the more remarkable about this moment is that 3 days later, Lincoln would stand for re-election in one of the most important elections in American history. He took time out of his day to make sure that justice was done for this young Black woman. I'm going to just close by showing you, I'm not going to read through this, but just showing you a list of all the record groups where I found letters from African Americans to Lincoln. And I think this is really important because many people who do research in African American history have gone to record groups where you expect to find letters from African Americans. And I searched a lot of other places as well. And what this tells you is all the different levers of government that Black people are pulling to try to get their needs met, to make a petition that applies to a different aspect of their lives. And those letters then get sent out to the different parts of the federal bureaucracy, depending on what that person's request is. So that is a very short snippet of the book, and it will be officially, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that you can see me. It'll be officially published on October 26th, but it already is shipping from Amazon. Several people have written to me that they already have it. And then, as Anne mentioned, I've got 2 other books coming out that I'll just very quickly mention. In November, I'm publishing a book with the University of Virginia Press called My Work Among the Freedmen. And it's the letters of a woman named Harriet Buss, who was a teacher for freed people during the Civil War and Reconstruction. And what's remarkable about her letters is she was a teacher for about an 8-year span. So they cover the war and Reconstruction. She was in the Sea Isles of South Carolina. She was in Norfolk, Virginia, and Raleigh. And her most famous student was Robert Smalls, the very famous slave who escaped and became a congressman. And then in February of 2022, I'm publishing a history of Black visitors to the Lincoln White House called A House Built by Slaves, African-American Visitors to the Lincoln White House, with Roman and Littlefield. So with that, thank you so much for joining us, and I'm happy to take any questions that come in.
Thank you so much for giving that wonderful presentation. We have a few questions here, but I want to start off by thanking you so much for an engaging, very timely conversation. A lot of the stories that you mentioned just kind of reminded me a little bit of some cases that have been brought up today in regards to gender and race and the social climate right now. So one of the questions that I had for you earlier on, you mentioned Sergeant John F. Shorter, and there was a person right before him that I couldn't quickly write down his name. Do you know how old they were?
Yeah, so I could tell you, in a lot of the cases, so when I originally did the book, I had gone through all the pension records and the military service records for each of the correspondents. And I originally included a physical description for each correspondent, just so that people could kind of get a sense of, you know, in most cases, we don't have images of what they looked like. In almost all the images that I showed tonight are in the book. And so if you pick up the book, you'll be able to see what some of the people look like, some of the correspondents. I think I included Shorter's age, and so I'm just looking. Shorter, no, I didn't include Shorter's age, since that was a petition. So I could look it up, but I won't take the time to do that now. But he was a young man. I would guess he was in his early 20s, just based on the photograph of him in uniform.
Yeah, he just looked like one of those individuals that may have lied about his age, and was probably younger than he actually was, because he just looked that way. But given there are some Civil War soldiers from Illinois who did lie about their age, and they were like 15 years old.
Right.
So I was just commenting on that, but I think
and Thomas Pepper was the one before that. And I can actually tell you how old he was. Let's see. He was, or I can't. I found his picture, but I let me see here. Where's his letter? Here it is. Thomas Pepper was 20 years old.
Okay.
So in that photograph, he's about 20, or at least when he enlisted, that's how old he said he was. That photograph comes from his pension record at the National Archives. And there's actually a photograph of him as an old man in his pension record as well. I didn't include the older picture of him in the book, just the one of him as a young soldier.
Well, and the fact that these younger individuals knew how to write too is really fascinating, because you had some that were asking for if they were freed or not, and the fact that they knew how to write, that's got to be amazing to find.
Yeah, so it's illegal in the South for African Americans to learn how to read and write, for slaves to learn how to read and write. But there were ways that some did learn how to read and write. And so in the book I'm publishing in November, The Letters of Harriet Buss, the introduction, I talk about that process where in slavery days, how was it that African Americans learned how to read? And they would often have schools out in the woods late at night where one person would teach what he or she knew to others who were very eager to learn. In some cases, you have mistresses who are a little more compassionate than most and are willing to teach. So there's one correspondent in this book who that's how he learned how to read. His mistress taught him until she got in trouble. And then she no longer taught him, but at least he had a germ of what to do, and he was able to learn later. Others tricked children into learning how to read. One of the correspondents in this book tricked or like he bribed other white kids to teach him how to read. And of course, Frederick Douglass very famously tricked white children into teaching him how to read. And so there are all different mechanisms that enslaved people would have to use to learn how to read. And the estimates are that somewhere between 5 and 10% of enslaved people could read, which is in some ways maybe higher than we would expect, but also not very high at all.
Interesting. Well, we have a few questions from the audience. If you have not submitted your question yet, feel free to do so. Our first question comes from Bill Shepard. He
Hello,
says,
Bill.
Very interesting and thought-provoking presentation. Could you elaborate on the research you did to find original sources? The Library of Congress and the papers of Abraham Lincoln were mentioned. And how do you then choose the letters and documents you included in your book?
Yeah, so the papers of Abraham Lincoln has put 81,000 plus documents on their website. And what I did was I would pick different record groups that I thought might have African-American correspondence in them. And then I just went letter by letter. So it was no different than going to the National Archives and requesting a box and then going through the materials. It's just that I could do it from the comfort of my own home. And so I found most of the letters that way. But then I also would keyword search. And so now the papers of Abraham Lincoln are not transcribed and they're not keyword searchable except for by name. And so I essentially made a list of every prominent African-American I knew of from the Civil War era. And then I searched for their names. And if I was reading an article on some newspaper about a Black recruiter or a Black pastor or anyone, I would go in and then search for their name. And so I would find letters that way as well. I've got 125 in the book. It's for certain that is not exhaustive. I put in every letter that I found that I could with 100% be sure was written by an African-American. There are several letters that I think were, but that I wasn't positive. Some were written without a signature. And so, there was one from Toronto about Black soldiers, and I'm very confident it was probably written by a Black person in Toronto, but not knowing who the author was, I chose not to include things like that. I wanted to be certain of the correspondence in this book. But yeah, I started doing the research in 2014. I finished a big chunk of it in 2016. Some people read it. Edna Medford read it and some others read it. And then I got some feedback on what I could do with it. And then I went to work again and found probably another 20 or 30 letters and rearranged the book a bit and then sent it off to UNC Press. So it's been a long process. I have 3 books coming out in the next 4 months, but it's not like I did them all like in one compressed time. This one's been going on for a very long time.
Well, it sounds like a wonderful collection and varying and different individuals that you bring to light, all from, Miss Elizabeth Shorter, which I am wanting to learn more about her. That story is very inspiring, that she was a very strong woman, stood up for herself, and even went so far to petition the president for assistance. I mean, that's an amazing story to hear. And brings us to a very interesting question that we have next. Today, people bounce back and forth between the phrase Black individuals and African Americans. Michael Fry asks, when was the term African American first coined?
It's a great question. I don't know when it was coined. So I would guess, Afro-American was a very common term in the 60s and 70s. And so I would guess that it probably came into common usage as a more formal version of Afro-American. And so probably in the 80s is when it began to get into more common usage. But I'm a 19th century guy, so I'm hypothesizing there. I would say Google African American etymology, and you'll probably find a better answer than what I could give on the fly. I've seen some just uses of the phrase African American earlier, but I don't think it was in it. I don't think it became into common usage until Afro American probably fell out of usage. That would be my guess.
Yeah, because today, it's interesting to talk to some individuals because they prefer one over the other, based on their viewpoints.
Right.
And I've spoken with Catherine Harris about this exact topic. And she actually has been watching on YouTube, and she sent me a question for you.
Okay.
So I don't have it to bring up on the screen, but she says colorism was an issue back then, based on how dark you were versus how light
Mhm.
you were. Could you? She stated that you referenced complexion a couple of times within
Yeah.
the letters. Could you expand on that?
Sure.
She was just kind of interested to learn more about colorism within uh, the grouping of letters that you went through.
Yeah, so I'll talk about it in a couple different ways. So the one is the letters or the petition that I mentioned from the Creoles of New Orleans. So these are people of African, Spanish, and French descent primarily. And they are very wealthy. Some of them own enslaved people. They gave money to the Confederate war effort, although I have to qualify that by saying I think a big part of that was they're in Louisiana. Like they either have to support the cause or they're going to be in big trouble. So when the Union gets control of New Orleans, they throw their support behind the Union cause in April of 1862. They pay their taxes, and so they run newspapers in Louisiana, in New Orleans, and they see themselves as better than the darker skinned African Americans who are enslaved or even free. And so when they first go to the White House and ask for the right to vote, they are not at all concerned about African Americans who have dark skin. They are only concerned about African Americans who have light skin. And it's only through these conversations that they have with Lincoln that they together kind of broaden the request and say, okay, maybe it would be better to give all Black men the right to vote. But there is a very real prejudice on the part of lighter skinned African Americans against darker skinned African Americans in Louisiana. And you see it elsewhere as well. And the famous example that comes to mind is that Lincoln brings a Black servant with him to the White House. And the White House staff is very light skinned. And part of that is because of James Buchanan. So Buchanan decided during his presidency that he would only hire new White House servants who were trained in the English mode. So he's bringing in English butlers and servants and so forth. And most of the Black White House servants are very light skinned, and they refuse to work with this darker skinned African American that Lincoln brings from Illinois. And Lincoln has to help him find a job in the Treasury Department elsewhere outside of the White House because the Black White House staff refused to work with him. So yeah, what Catherine's describing was a very real thing. And so it gives a certain complexity to racial issues in the 19th century that I think a lot of people are probably not as familiar with.
I think that when you're looking at this, have you ever come across any descendants of these individuals, or any kind of connection
Yeah.
outside?
So the photo of Arnold Burtenow, I connected with his, great, 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 however many grandson, still has the same last name. And he gave me the high resolution scan of that photograph. and gave me permission to use it. So I include it both in this book, and then it'll also be in my book, A House Built by Slaves, in February of 22. He's the only one I've connected with who's a descendant of any of these particular letter writers. I have connected with I published a collection of letters of a Black soldier from the 3rd U.S. Colored Troops in the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography about 6 years ago. And through Ancestry.com, I connected with one of his descendants. So it's kind of a neat thing when you can get on something like a genealogy site and find some, I'm approaching a person as a historian, and then there's other people who are approaching them as a relative, and you might cross paths and connect and be able to share information with each other. And it really is a wonderful thing when you meet a descendant of, and you're able to connect in that way. Another one, one of the photographs in that mosaic that I showed that I didn't talk about was a guy named James T.S. Taylor. And James Taylor was from Albemarle County, Virginia. He joined a Black regiment. He got arrested for selling food things to local people in Florida and then keeping the money, although he said he wasn't really keeping the money, he was just holding it. And he wrote to Lincoln to get released. Well, after the Civil War, he returned to Charlottesville. He had gotten married in Florida, brought his wife with him, became a state politician and part of the state constitutional convention in Virginia after the Civil War. Well, he still has descendants who live in Albemarle County, and someone at the University of Virginia who's doing research on Black soldiers from that county found them, and they have photographs of him. And so if anyone's interested in him, I did a blog about him for the University of Virginia's now Civil War Center. It's NAU now. And you can Google it and read his letter and his story. And now there's a photograph of him that came through the descendants that I only came across a couple months ago. And unfortunately, it was not a high enough resolution to be able to include in the book. But just to be able to see his face and know what he looked like is really a cool thing. And to know that his descendants still live in Charlottesville is pretty cool as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of different historic sites now. They're reaching back and trying to find descendants of people who lived at certain plantations and historic place or worked at historic places.
Yeah.
And it's always fascinating to see the descendants come in, because it gives you kind of a little bit of a look of, what that person may have looked like based on some of the traits that they were showing, and seeing what treasure trove they have. I think Dr. Blight found that collection of Frederick Douglass
Frederick
papers.
Douglass,
Yeah.
It's nice when that happens. I mean, I've written a biography of a slave trader, and in this case, one of the descendants has a memoir that he wrote, and she will not share it with me. And it's just so frustrating as a historian, because I would love to know what's in that memoir. But she doesn't know me. Because she doesn't know me, she doesn't trust me. There's a lot of sort of feeling about, this guy, I should say this guy was convicted of slave trading, but he was never caught red-handed. And so in the biography, I'm kind of, I'm unclear in a sense of like whether or not he was really doing it, because he got arrested before he could carry it out. But this family, this person, my sense is, when you have a convicted slave trader in your history, you might not want to talk about it. You might not want to share those kind of records. So it's nice when family members do share, and it's frustrating when they don't.
Have you been able to utilize the new collection of Freeman's papers that are now available, or online to help you with your work, or is that like after majority of your research was done?
The collection at Duke?
Yes.
Is it Freedmen's Bureau papers?
I thought it was Freedmen's Bureau. I know that Ancestry has a link to.
Yeah, I've used the Freedmen's Bureau papers at FamilySearch.org pretty extensively, and I think the ones on Ancestry are similar. They're but I haven't gone into. I have an Ancestry membership, but I haven't gone in to look at those yet.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if you're able to find more letters as you continue your search.
I might not
And
want to though, because now that the book's out, I
yeah,
can't add anything in. But
well,
no,
you never know if you
I
want like
never
a
stop
book
looking.
2
That's
or
for sure.
something for it.
Yeah, volume 2.
Yes. All right. Well, it looks like we are running out of time. Folks, if you have any other questions, I feel free to reach out to John on Twitter. And I know that there's going to be some exciting movement among your books, and you'll probably have more book signings. Do you know where people might be able to get your book or get it signed?
Yeah, it's on Amazon, it's on Barnes and Noble. Hopefully it'll get carried in Barnes and Nobles around the country. Anne and I will be at the Lincoln Forum in a couple of weeks, and I'll be doing a panel there with Lucas Morell, Edna Medford, and Michelle Crowell talking about these letters and African Americans. Hopefully that'll be on C-SPAN, and then they'll have copies there for sale and a big book signing. So hopefully some of the folks watching here can go there and attend. And we have a wait list right now because with COVID we're kind of at capacity. But if you're interested, you can still register and get on the wait list, and hopefully still go.
Well, and become a member, because then you
And
can
become a
stay up
member
to
first.
date.
And actually, yeah, I'll throw this out there. The Lincoln Forum Bulletin, I'm the editor, and I will, in this current issue, I've got an article about Paschal Randolph, the sex magician, so you can learn a lot more about him. I don't give any secrets away there, though. And then in the spring 2022 issue, you're the first one to find this out, Anne. This is hot off the press. I haven't even told Harold Holzer yet. I'm planning to run Anderson Abbott's account in full of his when he and Alexander Augusta went to the White House and met with Lincoln at that party, at that
Oh,
reception. And
that'll be
so I'm just going to
exciting.
do an unabridged, here's his 4-page account. I got the original one from the Toronto Public Library, and I'm just going to type it out and put it in there. So if you're interested in learning more about these folks, that's a great way to do it.
Well, and there's so many different Lincoln historians you'll be able to come in contact with the forum, and there are so many wonderful articles that are within the newsletter, and it gives you an opportunity to speak with individuals who have the same interests and passion about Lincoln and his life and times, and the individuals that surrounded him. I always look forward to going to the forum every year. In addition to that, the Abraham Lincoln Association gets together on Lincoln's birthday every year, and it's another opportunity for folks to get together and learn more about Lincoln scholarship and research. And hopefully we'll be able to have your book on sale then too.
That would be great.
So, well, thank you so much, John, for coming and speaking about your book. I hope everyone enjoyed it. I know I did, and learned some new interesting things. And I know personally, I'm looking forward to getting your book in the mail. I pre-ordered it and counting down the days until
Well,
it comes
bring it to
in.
Gettysburg, and I'll be sure to inscribe it.
Yeah, I'm wanting to bring that book, and then I'm going to be keeping a lookout for your other two as well, because you speak about some very interesting people, and while I was listening to you, I was trying to write down everyone's name that you were talking about so I can find out more.
Excellent.
So thank you again so much, and folks, I hope you get an opportunity to pre-order Dr. White's book. To address you as my friend, and the other books that will be coming out, we'll make sure on the Center for Lincoln Studies to post when those come out, and give you the opportunity to pre-order those as well. Or who knows, we might see you at the Lincoln Forum. All right. Well, thank you again, everyone. And tune in next time when we have Dr. Burlingame come in, and he is going to speak about his book on African Americans and Abraham Lincoln called The Black Man's President. And his book will be coming out next month. And John, you actually had the opportunity to read some of Burlingame's work, if I'm correct.
Yeah, I had the opportunity to take his 2-volume massive biography of Lincoln, which I have right up there. And he needed it edited down into a single volume. And so I spent about a year and a half cutting it from 1.2 million words down to a little over 300,000 words. And it was a great experience to just get to dig into that. And I learned a lot in the process.
What's cool about the digital version of that book is the fact you have half the page, which is his writing, and the other half is his footnotes.
Right.
And I don't know about any other researchers out there, but I love footnotes more than endnotes.
I just tweeted about that earlier tonight.
It's so refreshing to not have to have two bookmarks when you're reading a book. So for any publishers out there who are listening in notes are very difficult for us. Footnotes are so much better.
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you folks for tuning in. And John, it's always a pleasure to speak with you, and looking forward to your book coming out and hearing what everyone thinks and what new information we're able to soak in about the rich history of Lincoln, his times, and the people who interacted with him.
Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.